Could you go more into detail about why exactly and what kind of evidence Judaism kind of posits against Christianity in terms of Christ's divinity? Like, what are the central arguments against it? Because I know, of course, one of them is historicity, like it's a historical argument. Like, could you go a bit deeper into that?
Well, there are no problems with church with Jesus's teaching.
Yeah.
And the Sermon on the Mount. Any rabbi could have said both in Jesus's time or today. And many of the things that Jesus said, I mean, his most famous for is love your neighbor as yourself, which, of course, is already in the Hebrew Bible. Ve'ahavta et re'echa kamocha. There's some Hebrew on your show. And it's in the book of Leviticus. So he was just quoting Jewish teaching. And I often have to remind people, yes, Jesus said it, but actually he was quoting the Hebrew Bible. So there's no problem with any of the ethics and the values. And the problem, if you like, only started after the death of Jesus and with Paul, who started preaching a very different type of faith. And then there's this battle, which again we see played out within the New Testament in the Acts of the Apostles, between the followers of Jesus, who were known as the Nazarenes, who saw him as a sort of super prophet, really, an Elijah figure, perfectly respectable within Jewish tradition, and those who belonged to the Pauline church, who saw him as something different and introduced these, what you might call Greek concepts of the Son of God and the Messiah, and not entirely human. And that's when there was called the Great Divide. It's really a matter of theology, and was Jesus Messiah or not? And we say no. Not that there's anything wrong, by the way, to claim to be the Messiah. And there have been dozens and dozens and dozens, I mean, hundreds perhaps, of Jews who have claimed to be the Messiah. And the Jewish attitude has always been, well, great, this is what we've been waiting for. And then after a day or two, it's quite obvious. And in one famous case, it took a year before it was quite obvious that peace wasn't there and didn't reign supreme. And therefore, this person was not necessarily an imposter, was maybe someone who's either, well, it could have been a charlatan, it could have been deluded, or could have just been hopeful or over-enthusiastic or preempting the Messianic age. Nothing wrong to be claimed to be the Messiah. And we're still waiting. But, as I said, not just sitting back, but trying to help our age come closer ourselves.
Almost setting the messianic example in some sense.
And again, I emphasize that for us, it's not the person that's important, like a Jesus, because in the Jewish concept, the Messiah will come and then probably die. But it's the era of peace, which is why we prefer to talk about the messianic era or messianic age.
Right. The points you made about the theology and the kind of, I guess, the differences between what Jesus actually said and then what Paul tried to promote it as. I'd be interested for you to expand on that, because that sounded like a really interesting avenue. I know it's perhaps quite a niche aspect of it all, and I'm not sure if that's something that you've thought about quite a lot in particular. But I'd be interested in hearing what Paul actually did and how and why you think it was so different from what Jesus genuinely actually meant when he was.
Well, one of the problems is we're not entirely sure what Jesus did mean, because a lot of the things he batted away. And when somebody, I think Pilate says, are you the Son of God or the King of the Jews? He says, that's what you say, or that's what people say. And it's very rare that Jesus actually makes an outright claim for himself. But it is Paul who sort of develops the picture and develops the theology, and really takes Jesus, from our point of view, away from the Jewish tradition in which he came. And again, just because it is not always obvious, but well, it will be to some people, Jesus was Jewish. And perhaps one of the most shocking things for some people is when I ask them, when you go into church, there's always like a calendar board where they've got the hymns, and it also tells the date and what festival or feast it is, because every day is virtually a feast day of this or that saint. Now, most people who don't go into church on January the 1st, they got a hangover from the night before. But if they do, they will see the date as the feast of the circumcision, because January the 1st is 8 days after December the 25th. December the 25th, Jesus is born. Jesus, being Jewish, is therefore circumcised, as laid out in the book of Genesis, on the 8th day. And people think, what? Jesus circumcised? And the idea of God being circumcised or that happening to the Son of God just doesn't ring true for a lot of people. But actually, it's all there within Christianity. So the Jewish roots of Jesus are really not under dispute by anybody. But once you get into the later books of the Bible, the letters to the Corinthians and Philippians and Thessalonians and so forth, then you get this sort of development, which then goes much further in the Church Fathers, of Jesus as somebody who gets sort of almost divorced or taken away from his Jewish context and becomes something totally different and an object of worship in himself, as opposed to what I think is more likely in the gospel, where he is a teacher and preacher, but he's not an object of worship.
Right. Yeah. That was really, really interesting. I'm particularly interested in the history and the I guess the conflict of ideas. And would you say, in that sense, that you could say Paul is actually the issue, not really Jesus? It's actually Paul who the Jewish kind of religion has this disagreement with fundamentally.
Yeah, and which is why, in scholarly books or academic books, you talk about Pauline Christianity. So the Christianity as developed by Paul. Now, that's fair enough, because I said earlier that Jews have changed and that we're no longer biblical Jews, we're rabbinic Jews. So Christians are probably Christians, not so much of the Gospels, but of the later books or the Pauline Christianity. But, that's fair enough. Islam has changed enormously as well. And to be fair, if Jesus came back, he'd probably have a fit. And if he walked into church, wouldn't recognize it at all, or the bishops or the popes. But the same would apply to Moses. Wouldn't know where he was in a synagogue, because all faiths have developed and changed over the centuries. They often claim to be the voice of tradition, but there's no doubt that tradition has changed enormously.
I often have this thought, and it came to me from reading Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov, and it was the idea that, let's say a kind of Messiah did come. Who's to say that the modern world did even embrace him, and even to demonstrate that he is the Messiah? I feel like, because initially it feels like, yeah, it would be easy. You would just study, I don't know, walking on water, let's say, and you could study whether that was genuine or not. But then people would say, oh, well, maybe it's a matrix, a mass hallucination by aliens. And so it's really interesting, because you talked about how these things are so difficult to prove, from a historical perspective, specifically. And I do think, would people even believe in a Messiah? Like, how would we even come to demonstrate that he would be? Have you thought about that issue? Because of course you're skeptical of the claim of Jesus being one, and of course that's 2,000 years ago. But do you think that would be a difficult process?
Well, the walking on water bit is a good example, because yes, people would say, how did he do it? And actually, to me, that would be a good example of, this is irrelevant. I mean, what's the big deal? I mean, okay, so he walks on water, but so what? That doesn't change anything.
Yeah.
So what would count, and I think what would people pay to, is, that people changed, and people were pleasant, and people were nice, and the criminals stopped being criminals, and dictators stopped invading other countries. And so that's always been the Jewish litmus test, not magic tricks like feeding the 5,000 or walking on water, or some other miracle, by anybody else, because big deal. It's actually being, and this is really the ultimate Jewish criteria. Does someone, Jesus or anyone, bring real lasting peace? If he's yes, Messiah. If not, well, let's keep waiting.
Is that's an interesting perspective, because I feel like even then, I mean, maybe from the Jewish perspective it would be legitimate, but to people outside of that, they would say, well, just because people are acting morally because a guy came and everybody listened to him, they'd be like, well, okay, but why does it make him the Messiah? And what would you say to that?
I wouldn't care. I mean, it doesn't matter whether they believe in the Messiah or not. The point is that Messianic age has come. Because again, we wouldn't get hung up whether you believe in him or don't believe in him, or pray to him or don't pray to him. The point is the era, the peace. And that would be just such a wonderful, almost unbelievable state to arrive at, given the world as it is. But, I mean, what does every politician say? I'm in politics to make things better. I mean, I suppose the same would apply to anybody who goes to church, mosque, synagogue, gurdwara. We're praying not just for ourselves, but also for society as a whole. And we pray that wars will be ended and famines will come to an end, etc., etc. So we all have this basic motive of trying to not only look out for ourselves, but look out for the wider world that we're part of. And if that comes, that will be sufficient in itself.
Yeah, the Messiah.
And which is why, again, Judaism doesn't really put so much emphasis on the Messiah, whether it's going to be a he or a she or tall or ugly or die the next day. It's the era, it's the time of peace and people getting on with each other. It comes back to that simple love your neighbor as yourself, which is, probably the best political slogan you'll ever come across.
Yeah, it is intriguing how a Christian would kind of respond to that, like, the Messiah coming again, and they would probably say, yeah, miracles and water, performing exorcisms. But then actually you would turn around and say, under Judaism, actually, no, it's about how moral and how the positive influence moves civilization forward. I find that distinction really interesting, that it is in that sense. I guess from a personal perspective, I'm still stuck on that thing of how would we genuinely demonstrate that? I mean, in a loose sense, we could say, somebody, I don't know, I mean, because you could say about a politician, for example, you could say, look, this guy is great, his rallies are great, and people are following him. Does that make him the Messiah? I guess I'm still stuck on how to, how would you?
Yeah, you're stuck on that because again, get away from rituals, get away from belief. It doesn't matter whether you worship the Messiah or not.
Yeah.
The point is, it's what's happening outside your window when you look outside. Is the street safe or not? Are people cheerful or unhappy? So, if people acknowledge the Messiah as the Messiah, great. And if they don't, well, he's still the Messiah, or rather the Messianic era is still there. So if you don't mind me saying so, you seem to be very locked into a sort of Christian concept of worship or obedience or faith. It doesn't really matter.
Right.
It's here.
Well, I suppose it's tempting to be locked in a Christian mentality, and I guess, from a dispositional perspective, like Judeo-Christian, the ethos is heavily in Western civilization for sure.